Welcome to the fourth episode of the Sport Analytics Podcast. Today, we're joined by Riley Leonard, who is a data scientist at FanDuel and has also worked in the baseball analytics department with the Boston Red Sox. Riley, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. This is
Yeah,
my
of course. Yeah,
my
yeah,
first time on the podcast, so I'm
yeah. It'll be a great experience. Yeah. So obviously, kind of want to start by asking maybe your current role at FanDuel, as a data scientist in the sports modeling and innovation department. So could you like describe us like what a typical day looks for you as a data scientist at FanDuel, and how do you prioritize your task in a fast-paced sports environment?
yeah, that's a great question. I'd say a lot of sports analytics are involve predictive modeling, but I think that's especially true in sports betting since when you think about like the odds and prices on different sports betting markets, what we're really looking at is just probabilities. And so my job as a data scientist with sports modeling team at FanDuel is to calculate those probabilities. So I'd say the majority of my time is spent doing just various predictive modeling tasks. I specifically work kind of on the baseball side, so it is the off season right now, which means kind of like to address the second part of your question. In the off season, we don't have to deal with as much like chaos with live bets coming in constantly, and for baseball games being played every day. Um, and so off season, we're more just kind of like tending to the models that we've already built and trying to improve them, and really just trying to deliver like the best, most accurate prices possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Kind of a question about like some of the tools and data you use. Which programming languages, databases, or statistical packages you find yourself using most often, and do you have any favorites that may facilitate your workflow?
Yeah, so for me, I use R exclusively. I know a lot of my colleagues use R and Python. I don't know any Python, which maybe is abnormal for someone working in data science in sports. Um, but for me, I felt like once I gained fluency in one language, I thought it was better just to have depth in one language than breadth across languages. And so I really like just kind of committed to just learning more and more R. So, and I still use R all the time. I used it in college. I used it with the Red Sox, and I use it now. As far as like the data I use and the packages I use, um, what's nice about baseball is so much of the data is publicly available. MLB just like publishes all their pitch by pitch data on the Statcast website, and so that's really the same data I've been using really for like the last 5 years or so in all of my academic projects with the Red Sox and now with FanDuel. We're really using that like same Statcast pitch by pitch data that the MLB has like worked really hard to curate and publish and make publicly available. So it's kind of a great opportunity for people maybe who don't have all the same resources that someone like working in a professional sports team or working for FanDuel has, but um, you can still get that data just online through MLB, and that's something I encourage people to do if they're interested in baseball data analytics.
Yeah, it's really inspiring. Yeah, it's great how they have so much public data available.
Mhm.
Kind of like related to the sports betting side. Sports betting lines can shift by the minute. What are the biggest challenges in dealing with live data and real time model updates?
Yeah, that's another great question. Yeah, I'd say one of the biggest differences from being like in an academic context and like working on independent research projects is that, when you're in school, you have like a lot of time to work on a project and the data set you're using is very static. So, like for my thesis, for example, I had pitch by pitch data and I used that same data set for months. The features kind of stayed the same. The analysis I was doing was kind of just iterating on itself. Whereas when you're working either in an MLB team or now with FanDuel and you're like dealing with data that's like dynamic and changing, you're dealing with customers who are actually placing live bets. I think you really had to think about like the robustness of your models and the robustness of your features and looking out for edge cases because if your data breaks or if your model breaks, while like something is actually live and online, it can have a lot more serious of a consequence than if you're just working with like a static data frame. Um, so we do like a lot of testing on the back end just to make sure, we spend like the entire off season testing our models to make sure that there's no bugs. Debugging becomes really important. It's like a huge priority. And then just looking out for different and just always keeping in mind different edge cases. Like how can we be robust to those edge cases? How can we like make sure that our model is kind of prepared for anything, even like an emergency?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. in kind of relation to some of the other departments that are present in FanDuel, how do you work with these other departments, such as like product or risk management, to ensure that your data-driven insights actually make it into the platform or business decisions?
Yeah. So I guess me specifically, I work in the sports book. So as data scientists, I think the other department we probably work most closely with is our traders. The
Mhm.
traders are like the people who are actually like on the front lines, like taking live bets, like making those actual transactions with customers. Um, and so it's really important to have like a good communication and an open, like a good solid relationship with those other members of the organization because you know um, I guess it's one thing to like have predictions you feel confident in pregame, but like when things are changing, it's also important that like you're adaptable and that also like your model outputs are interpretable by people who maybe aren't as familiar with the data. So like our traders are really good at you know following the games and making like kind of on the spot predictions, but might not be as familiar with like the data we've been using. And so it's really important to like communicate that clearly and like be on the same page, and then also kind of learn from and build on their skills as well because they have a lot of kind of basketball or baseball or football insight that as data scientists we sometimes miss because they're watching a lot more games. So it's like very kind of a reciprocal relationship we have with the trading department. We try to learn from each other.
Yeah, it seems really interesting. That collaboration between different departments. Kind of relate to FanDuel as a whole. It's a large organization with regulatory, user experience, and security constraints. How do these constraints shape or limit the analytical work that you can do?
It's another good question. I think again, like working in the sports book, I'm kind of like in a bubble where I'm really fortunate. I just kind of get to work with the sports data and make sports predictions. We
Mhm.
do have like other departments and teams across the country that are more focused on like developing the user experience. Like we have a customer experience team, I think in Atlanta, who are like building the app, which is obviously like really important. That's like our core product. But as for us, like sports data scientists, we kind of have the privilege of just mostly kind of working on our sports models, which is really fun, and I'm lucky to get to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would like a type of job like that in the future. I think it would sound really interesting. Kind of shifting gears to your time with the Red Sox, because you recently, interned with them before you entered FanDuel. Can you broadly outline your responsibilities as a baseball analytics intern and how you contributed to the analytics team?
Yeah, so last summer I got to spend a summer in Boston with the Red Sox in their analytics department. Specifically, I worked kind of on the player evaluation side, which is as far as like analytics goes. There's usually different departments in the baseball analytics teams, and there are some people who work on like in-game strategy, like stolen base decisions or like pitch decisions or like bullpen models. There's usually like departments that work on player development. Um, there's like usually baseball science teams who are working on like injuries or you know motion capture data, really cool stuff like that. But for me, I was mostly working on player evaluation, which is kind of like maybe like the most like kind of traditional and conventional role in a baseball front office, which is how do we like evaluate and judge players? How do we project players and their future performance? And like um, how do we evaluate draft prospects or like different like maybe trade decisions, stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think a lot of people would also love to work for a team and do that type of work. Kind of like kind of want to ask about your experience, kind of like further on that, like what was it like stepping into a major league front office as an intern, and did anything like surprise you about how a pro sports team actually uses the data that's available?
I guess the biggest surprise was that maybe it was maybe less intimidating than I was expecting.
Mhm.
Just because like I hadn't even been to Boston before, and I was going into one of the most kind of famous baseball stadiums, like kind of a legendary venue, Fenway Park, and
Mhm.
I didn't know what to expect, but like everyone there was really nice. Um, I found that the work life balance was really good, and I don't know, I kind of went in there expecting it to be like really like a high strung, super intense environment, and like obviously the Red Sox take winning very seriously, like they have a really good department there, but also like I found I guess the interpersonal relationships were a lot stronger and more casual than I was expecting. Like everyone was really friendly. I have nothing but great things to say about all the different people I worked with there. And I guess another kind of surprise is, at least like seeing how a front office operates. it's a lot more kind of like, like a video game or fantasy sports than I was expecting.
Mhm.
Obviously, I'm like degrees of separation away from being like a GM, but like as far as like what the GM's day to day looks like and like how they're using insights, it's almost like playing fantasy baseball in a way. You're talking to other GMs, negotiating trades, especially around the trade deadline. You're, using data to evaluate, draft prospects and stuff like that. Same way, like a fantasy player would do before uh, like a fantasy baseball draft. So I just thought that stuff was all kind of cool. It was very eye opening.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. Yeah. Kind of, one thing I wanted to ask is like, professional sports, obviously they involve a lot of tight deadlines and quick turnarounds. How do you convey these analytical findings in like time sensitive situations without like overwhelming the coaches or executives that you were talking to?
Yeah, I think, and we hear this from like, professors all the time, perhaps like when we're in data science class, but like communicating data is like just as important as the accuracy of your predictive models. Um, and so that's something like, especially in sports, that you had to think about constantly because kind of how I was saying about like at FanDuel with traders and data scientists, we have very different skills. In pro sports, you have scouts and coaches who might have very different skills and backgrounds to the data scientists. So it's kind of about finding, like a common language that you can hopefully build off of each other with.
Mhm.
So as far as like our relationship as like analysts with scouts, it's like how do we communicate sometimes kind of complex data processes in a way that's like digestible for someone that might not have a statistics or math background. And then on the other side, like, you know, people who work more closely with players might have insights into like their process that we might not understand as non-athletes. So again, like having really strong communication and also being like open-minded and collaborative is really important,
Mhm.
especially like, I don't know, I guess there's always like discourse about analytics versus eye test. And I think, especially in the front office, I think it's about kind of respecting that balance and also respecting each other. I think like the Red Sox are an organization that did a really good job at both of those things. Like, our
Yeah, that relationship is something that a lot of teams, I think, and even like fans, when they're trying to evaluate players, that's something they need to figure out.
Mhm.
Kind of like kind of comparing your both experiences you had with the Red Sox and what you're doing currently with FanDuel. You've seen both sides. The inner workings of a baseball team's R&D department and the sports betting company. What do you see as like the biggest contrast, and are there any surprising overlaps that you see in the two types of work you did?
I guess the biggest overlap is ultimately like the actual data we're working with and the sort of predictions we're making are very similar. Like I said at the beginning, like the pitch by pitch data is almost identical. We're working with the exact same kind of data. The main difference I'd say is like the actual nature of the predictions we're making are kind of concentrated in a different way. Like in baseball in a front office, like the questions, like the research questions you're asking in player evaluation specifically is how will this player perform over like a really long time horizon? We're interested in projecting a player's career over the entirety of their team control. So we might be looking at like, we might be interested in price or like kind of coming up with a value of like a 10-year extension. And that's like a very, like big question. Like how do we project that? Whereas in sports betting, everything's like really like kind of concentrated and dynamic. We're looking at like what's going to happen in this game, or sometimes like what's even going to happen in this at bat when it comes to like pricing player props, for example.
Mhm.
And so we're working with similar data, and we're obviously talking about baseball still, but I'd say the scope is very different. Like FanDuel and sports betting is very much focused on like the individual game or like predicting, you know, individual random events in uh, different like sporting games, whereas in a front office, you're like more interested in projecting, a player's career, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that makes
It might not be like a total generalization. Like some people might have different experiences working with different teams, but at least for my roles, that was probably the biggest difference.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of transitioning. I should have introduced you to this, but yeah, you completed a thesis at Cornell. Related to the field of sport analytics, specifically in behavioral baseball. You analyze cognitive biases in MLB swing decisions. What inspired you to tackle that topic, and what are some of your main takeaways from that project?
I guess the main inspiration for me was, I had this kind of more of a social science background. I studied um, economics primarily in undergrad, and so I didn't really have like a ton of us like a really like thorough statistics or data science background. Like I'd taken like a lot of sociology and political science and economics. So when it came to like writing my master's thesis and looking for like, kind of a big research project, I was interested in kind of bridging my two interests, which is social science and sports analytics. And so I figured like behavioral science would be a good kind of bridge between those two kind of like ostensibly very different fields. And so I knew I wanted to find some sort of like behavioral economic application of sports analytics data. And I had been working with so much pitch by pitch data. Um, so I decided to do the thesis on looking at like cognitive biases in swing decisions, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Did you have any main takeaways, from doing that research? Anything that maybe was interesting and something you didn't expect?
I guess the main takeaway is maybe unsurprising, and that's that um, baseball players, as humans, are occasionally prone to different behavioral biases,
Mhm.
as can be expected. I think kind of the way I looked at it is there's two real types of decision making in pro sports. One is like the slow thinking decision
Mhm.
making. One is very fast thinking. And the reason I chose swing decisions specifically is because that's like a very fast decision. Like less than like 200 milliseconds to make a swing decision. The pitcher, on the other hand, with the pitch clock now has less time, but still has 15 or so seconds to like come up with a pitch decision. Choose which pitch they're going to throw, where they want to locate or command that pitch. But the batter is still reacting almost instantaneously. And so what I found in my research is that these quick decisions, because they're made so rapidly, are more prone to behavioral bias than those slower decisions. And so swing decisions are in particular, you see a lot more cognitive biases. And the biases I looked at specifically were uh, loss aversion and the representativeness heuristic. I can go into more detail about that if you want.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see kind of that like nexus between the behavioral side and the
Mhm.
analytical side. So yeah, that was really interesting. You also studied your undergrad at Reed College, so I was going to ask what core skills or lessons from your studies at both Reed and Cornell have proven invaluable in your professional work at FanDuel and the Red Sox.
So I read is like kind of a very kind of classic liberal arts college. So I took a huge variety of classes, and that I think that was really important to me. Like I said, with my thesis, a lot of it was about kind of combining insights from different like social sciences with sports analytics, and like that's something I think I really appreciated about my undergrad education is that I was able to take classes in so many different fields. I found that really valuable. I guess that's like kind of like building off that. It is a piece of advice that I give a lot of people when they're thinking about like which classes to take. Maybe not necessarily like one or two specific classes, but just in general, I think it's good to take as many classes from a variety of fields as possible because there's so much stuff to learn, like in terms of like actual, knowledge and insights from these fields, but also just in terms of like kind of feeding your intellectual curiosity. It's good to kind of branch out in as many ways as possible and try to like kind of, I guess, draw from a diverse set of learnings.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And considering you did academic research, obviously with your thesis and any other opportunities you may have had, I wanted to ask, like, how do you compare the pace and goals of academic research with industry analytics, which you're doing currently? Like, did anything catch you off guard when transitioning from a research environment to a professional sports setting?
Yeah, it's another good question. I guess it relates to kind of what I was saying about earlier in terms of like the scope of the questions you're answering.
Mhm.
Um, like especially now, like a lot of like the stuff I do at FanDuel is very kind of in the moment and focused on addressing like immediate, pricing and models that are like coming up like as games and bets come in. Whereas in doing like an academic project, you're focused on the exact same question and you're kind of answering it over a really long period of time. Like a thesis is something is kind of a year long project, or even just like shorter projects can sometimes take weeks or even months. So it kind of requires a different type of. They each present their own challenges. Like one is much faster paced and maybe can feel overwhelming, but it's kind of exciting. And then the other requires like a lot of focus and commitment, and sometimes that can be overwhelming in its own way. Um, so yeah, two very unique kind of experiences, but both very valuable in their own way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In terms of your public portfolio, you've showcased several analytics projects over the years, how important do you think it is for students or job seekers to build their own public-facing portfolio of work? And maybe what would you recommend in terms of the type of work that they can show?
Yeah, I would almost say it's the single most important thing that I would personally encourage people to do when especially if they're still in school, because I guess it works in two ways. One, you're building those skills as you do the research. Like it's a fun way to actually like apply things you're learning in like a actual like, like concrete problem. Especially when it comes to like statistics, because like sometimes those concepts can feel kind of abstract, but then when you actually get to exercise those skills you learned on like maybe data that excites you or you're interested in, um, it can be both fun and very helpful in terms of building those skills. Um, so that for just for that reason alone, it's like a good reason to like work on your own projects and find ideas and data that excites you. And then also, it's just like a really good way to like demonstrate those skills. Once you've built those skills, it's a really good way to exhibit like both your growth professionally and academically. And then also, employers just find it really kind of interesting. It's an easier way to gauge your skill and your interests than just like a line on a resume.
Mhm. Yeah, I think for sure. Yeah, that's something that could be really helpful for all these applications. Kind of relating to maybe our mission here at Sport Analytics, where we're trying to provide certifications and teaching to students. You've operated in both MLB and sports betting. So, from your perspective, which technical or analytical skills should be front and center in the sports analytics curriculum, like what we're doing here?
I think, I guess first and foremost, I'd say what's helped me the most is having fluency in at least one programming language.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes that can be a bit of like an intimidating or steep learning curve. Like when I first went to college, I never thought of myself as a statistician or a data scientist. I never even imagined I'd be learning a coding language. But once I learned R, I felt like I unlocked almost a world of possibility.
Mhm.
Um, so I think like just like having that sort of fluency it really opens a ton of doors in terms of the stuff, different actual like analytics that you're able to do.
Mhm. Yeah, it
And then
makes.
after that, I'd say like maybe I mentioned earlier, like communicating data is super important. So I think like having like data visualization skills and writing skills
Mhm.
are both very kind of underrated when it comes to analytics, especially if you work in a front office environment where like being able to communicate your insights to different audiences is absolutely essential. So having like those data visualization skills and those writings and communication skills are also really important.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And also like kind of transitioning over to soft skills. Like, are there any like topics, tools, or like yeah, including soft skills, like any of those that you feel like are missing from some of the analytics programs that you may have dealt with, either in your undergraduate or graduate studies, or even externally, things that you wish you may have learned earlier.
Yeah, I definitely do encourage people just to do, to kind of maybe dabble or try research in different fields. I think like learning to like write academically was a skill that I found very useful. I didn't learn to write academically doing sports analytics. I learned it by taking like sociology and political science classes. So that was really useful. And that kind of goes back to that point about communication, like being able to effectively communicate your work and your research um, is one of like the most important skills. And I guess maybe like so I think maybe some of those technical skills are a little bit more, I don't want to say easier now, but certainly more accessible because we have a lot more tools. Like when I was learning how to code, ChatGPT didn't exist, and now I feel like it makes a lot of kind of the menial coding tasks a lot easier and more accessible, which I think um, is often a good thing. It kind of reemphasizes soft skills.
Yeah,
But that doesn't, I still think having that basic fluency is also really important. I think like ChatGPT is a really good professional tool, but not a really good academic one because it doesn't necessarily force you to learn the things. But it does also allow you maybe to emphasize other skills because the technical tasks are a lot easier now. So maybe
yeah.
it's communication and writing more important as a result.
Yeah, that makes sense. Looking ahead, what emerging technologies, data streams, or analytical methods in sports, excite you the most, whether in like MLB, sports betting, or any field of sports in general?
I think so. I guess MLB is always really coming up with like cool new ways to measure data. One thing I saw at the Red Sox that they're doing a lot of is like motion capture data for like biomechanics. Um, it's not something like I'm necessarily like very adept in, but it certainly looks really cool. It's something I'd like to learn more about. Just some of the cool things they're doing with these new technologies. Like Statcast, was pretty novel when it was introduced just a decade ago, and now it seems pretty ordinary.
Mhm.
And it just kind of goes to show like how fast this adoption of new technologies is occurring in professional sports, and even more so in like NFL. Like I think, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you've worked like with some of the big data bowl stuff. And they're
Yeah, I've dealt with it a little bit. Yeah.
yeah, they're I haven't done as much or if any work with like football data, but like the NFL is also has all these cool next gen stats. They're doing all sorts of cool stuff with tracking technology. Um, and yeah, it's pretty exciting. So a lot of it's publicly available. So lots of cool data you can just find online. That's really kind of like you had mentioned, emerging.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, finally, just as a last piece of advice, do you have any one piece of advice for someone who dreams of working in a professional sports environment, such as an MLB, FanDuel, or any other professional analytics role? Like, do you have any piece of advice for them?
I guess kind of like building off of maybe some of the themes of a lot of the things I've said about like kind of emphasizing various fields of study and not just getting bogged down in maybe like just the pure statistics.
Mhm.
I'd say like it's good to treat sports analytics maybe not just as a science but also as an art in a way. Um, on one hand, like sports analytics are very functional. We're building predictive models to like produce insights for teams to like help athletes develop, or like in a sports betting context, like make the most accurate predictions possible. Like it's very kind of functional and empirical. But on the other hand, like I think sports analytics can also be really beautiful. Like for me, sometimes there's nothing like more satisfying than like a nice data visualization, or like black ink on a sports reference page. Like in a way, like sports analytics is about kind of constructing and assigning almost like an aesthetic meaning to sports. And it's easy to lose sight of that sometimes. Like sports are a game and they're fun, and sports analytics should also be fun.
Mhm.
And I guess all that to say is like, if you are interested in sports analytics, just like kind of follow your heart and have fun, find problems or like research that excites you and like pursue it. Especially if you're still in school, because there's lots of time to learn skills. Like, yeah. So I guess that's an optimistic message. Like follow your heart, have fun, try your best, all that stuff.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. Thanks a lot, Riley. Your advice, all your insights have been really inspiring, and I'm sure our viewers will use it to great use.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks, everyone.